Just getting settled and waiting for our panelists to join us. Welcome, Sundaram.
Thank you.
Here we are. I think everyone's present and correct. Right, let's go. Welcome to the second discussion in a three-part series of live webinars titled New Models for New Times, Rethinking the Art Market in a Changing World, in partnership with Cromwell Place. This webinar is titled Breaking Boundaries, Local is the New Global. Over the past few decades, the art world has become increasingly globalised, but COVID-19 has severely disrupted international travel, contributing to a huge reduction in real life of major art fairs and biennials. As a result, the pandemic is forcing our industry to rethink this global model and look more locally for solutions. In this panel, dealers from Africa, Asia, the US and the UK will discuss how they grapple with running galleries for local audiences and how they continue to foster cross-cultural dialogues as some borders remain closed. We'll also hear their views on the future and whether we'll see more of a global approach going forward, i.e. one that considers both local and global factors. There'll be a 50-minute Q&A at the end, so please submit your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. There's no need to wait to the end, so please do ask away. That just leaves me to introduce our panel. We've got Rakeb Sile, who co-founded Addis Fine Art in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia in 2016, and on the 27th of October will open in Cromwell Place in London. We have Lehmann, who co-founded Lehmann Malcolm Gallery in New York in 1996, and also has galleries in Hong Kong, Seoul, and now Cromwell Place. We have Sundaram Tagore, who has opened galleries in New York, Singapore, and Hong Kong, and shortly to open in London. And Ayo Adeyinka, who is a London-based art dealer who founded Taffeta Gallery in 2013, and he specialises in 20th century and contemporary African art. And he also runs a project space in Lagos. So first of all, I wanted to ask each of our panellists how they've dealt with running a gallery for local audiences and whether the current shift to the local has been a help or a hindrance to business. Rakeb, if I could come to you first, because the Ethiopian government was quite strict and quite swift with its lockdown, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, they locked down in a very strict way at the beginning of April. So we had to actually close our gallery midway through a show, middle of April. So, you know, it was a strict lockdown, everything shut down, everyone had to wear masks and so on. So we were unsure to begin with kind of what we were supposed to do, but actually in the end, you know, our space in Addis is so central to all of our operations. It was very difficult for us to pivot anywhere else really for our local audience. So what we decided to do is actually physically move the gallery to a more conducive place so that we had more space for social distancing. We had more space for to do, you know, to have people wait outside the gallery before they can come in. So we really had to think about how we could physically come back as quickly as possible. And I mean, thankfully, because also just the government was so strict to begin with, things did come back kind of end of August. Things were, you know, able to open. So we did open our gallery second week of September of this year in a different place. So we also moved it from a very commercial area to a bit more residential space. So, you know, people could just walk to the gallery from their homes rather than come into town and be in this commercial hub. So we had to think about our physical space in a real way in order to just keep our local engagement going.
Would you say you rely on those face-to-face interactions, perhaps more in Addis than elsewhere? And did those face-to-face interactions convert into sales during that time?
Yes, I mean, face-to-face is pretty much how everything is done in Ethiopia, really. I mean, even with our artists, you know, we had to go to their studios, make sure they're okay. It's a very kind of in-person transactional culture. So we really couldn't just pivot online and just, you know, think that we would have kept our local audience with us. So, you know, Masai, thankfully, my business partner, lives in Addis, and he has very personal, strong relationships with all of our collectors, also our artists. So he was able to make, even, you know, in the 3 months or 4 months when we were actually closed, able to maintain those personal relationships going face to face or over the phone. So it's still very much, we're in that kind of, in that kind of place in Addis.
And would you say, I mean, were sales forthcoming?
Yeah, so I think that sales did happen. They stopped for a while, but actually once we opened the gallery in September, we have a show on by a young artist called Salome Muleta, and that sold out. So people were really happy to be back in the gallery, happy to look at the art, happy to also buy. So we're happy with the way that we've kept people engaged in our program at home. Yes.
Thank you, Rakeb. Sundaram, if I could come to you, you've got galleries in Hong Kong and Singapore as well as New York. How has this shift to the local affected your galleries in Asia?
Well, since for last 2 decades, we've been traveling extensively. And I think that's really true for medium-sized galleries or large galleries. And as our clients globalized, we globalized with them. And that post-COVID or during COVID, that changed and it came to a screeching halt. And so suddenly I thought we were done, we were finished. Because you have to understand, being in New York and having lived in New York, we went through many upheavals. You know, we had 9/11, we had this blackouts, the Hurricane Sandy, financial crisis, but this was unheard of, you know, across the globe. So this was really severe. And I thought, okay, 4 galleries, maintaining all these spaces is impossible. But something happened, something strange happened. I started getting invitations on WhatsApp from my clients and from the artists. And they were kind of prolonged, long, extended conversations. And these conversations were really meaningful. And so with that, and then we started sending them sort of a digital sort of exhibition that was taking place in a New York gallery, whether it was in Chelsea or Madison Avenue. And people were responding and people started buying art. And from being in a hopeless situation, suddenly we were looking at completely a new scenario, that you don't have to go to all these art fairs and all these crisscrossing the globe. We'd be in one morning, we'll be in Hong Kong, the next day in Sydney, and so on and so forth. And plus having all these other galleries. And so the conversation got deeper and really meaningful in that way. And we were able to provide them with what they were looking for. And the clients were not traveling. And because they were not traveling, they were not attending the operas or Broadway or museums. They were bored and they were really interested in having a conversation that was distinctly different from the kind of conversation they were having at home. Mm-hmm. So, and art was a big escape for them. And it brought in something, kind of something more meaningful. And because they had blank walls and they were asking me, what do you think of this artworks? And then we would actually, our designers would create a kind of design it for them. They would send us a photograph of the wall and we will add the paintings. And so instead of being dire, it kind of turned around. And so we were very optimistic about it.
And have you had a similar response in Hong Kong and Singapore? I mean, there's been different effects of the pandemic in those regions. I mean, Hong Kong wasn't, there weren't the same sort of very strict lockdowns as we saw in the US and Europe. How have your galleries in Asia, in Singapore and Hong Kong dealt with local audiences?
Right. So Singapore had gone through virus, was exposed to the virus earlier than in New York. And so what they managed to control it fairly well. And so they brought it back to a near normalcy now. You have to wear a mask, you have to follow all these rules, but people are able to go to galleries and move around. And so all these collectors who are in Singapore, they started coming into the galleries, making appointments. And so we have had very brisk sales in that respect. Hong Kong, for me, I was one of the earliest galleries to arrive there. And also decided to leave Hong Kong because of the political upheaval. And so I've scaled it down. I had 3 floors and I've only one small space. And I've scaled it down. Most of the people, I've moved them to Singapore. And so that's the situation where I am now.
That's interesting because Singapore is emerging as a front runner in terms of a hub, not only for travel reasons, but as you say, the political upheaval is causing uncertainty. Do you see Singapore as perhaps...
A lot of clients have moved to Singapore. Quite a few of the clients in Southeast Asia and people, they are moving to Singapore right now. And that's one of the reasons we have benefited a lot from that.
Thank you, Sundaram. That was fascinating. Rachel, if I could come to you, you spent most of lockdown in New York, right?
Yes.
How has the slowdown and more sort of local approach affected how you run your business?
So I guess I want to answer the second part of your question first, and then I'll talk specifically about New York. We've always been global with a local approach. And the question is why? And the answer is kind of, we learned by experience. It didn't really help us if we had support from, let's say, from New York and Hong Kong. So we had this global vision with local galleries in Hong Kong, in Seoul, and now in Cromwell Place, but the support was local. And the support meant for us also artists who were there, right? So going back to the first part of your question, as New York shut down completely, and I would say that we shut down March 13th, and maybe for 5-6 weeks, it was like, I didn't hear anything. I heard my team, but I didn't hear any other noise. But at the same time, Korea was working, Hong Kong was working, there were different stages, and those local communities were in a better place than New York was. So that local support, which is today what we are seeing, which actually has been emphasized in Cromwell Place with being very local, and we have Isabella Icos who is leading it local, a local person. However, the vision was strategically global. Yes, we had artists in London, but the idea was a gateway to the rest of Europe and to Asia. So that part now is very quiet, right? The gateway, nobody is traveling so much between London and Asia, or London even right now, not so much into Europe. But that has worked. That has worked. So New York was very quiet, but the rest was working.
And when you say New York was very quiet, I mean, did you find that, as Sundaram said, you know, that collectors had more time, you're having more fruitful and in-depth conversations, that collectors are in the galleries rather than on this sort of non-stop circuit, international circuit?
So I found really a lot of things. First of all, as I said, 5-6 weeks, total quiet. And then it became very clear that collectors were actually enjoying looking at the art hanging at home. And we're more and more interested in the spiritual, in the meaningful connection. There were the support that we're getting from the art they own. So collectors started reaching out to us. We started reaching out back to collectors, and a mechanism started coming into place, which was partly, and I don't want to talk about it now, I believe you'll maybe want to know about it later, the whole technology which is in place, we're zooming in, came into place. So we were able to create a studio visit with a curator. But I thought, and I can even reflect to what's happening now, New York is open since July. People don't come in huge masses like they used to come before. They come. They absolutely come. We have openings with 150 people, and you have meaningful meetings one-on-one, if it is a collector, if it is an advisor, if it is a museum director. So there is a switch, and it is active in a different way, a different rhythm, different volume.
We saw this with Cromwell Place opening last week. I mean, in London, it created a buzz, and it was obviously done in a socially distanced way, but you just opened there. But I wondered if you could tell us a bit about, you know, your reasons behind that, and how you view that particular local hub in South Kensington in London.
Yeah, it's so interesting how those things work. We were hungry pre-COVID, and I'm so insisting on it. Pre-COVID, a lot of things that are happening now are emphasizing what was needed. So for us, what was needed for us? We needed a place where we can add something to the normal white cube, right? What could we add? We could add conversation. We could add with artists. We could add invitation to a curator. We could add a performance. We could add a reading, something which was different, which was more intimate. So our vision was to do that in London, which, as you very well know, has so many amazing and very big galleries everywhere. So that was the vision. It is fantastic what Cromwell has brought already to Lehmann Maupin. I will tell you that certain artists which opened up with this first opening at Cromwell Place roughly a week ago never got this attention in Great Britain. Billy Childish was always a wild artist that nobody wanted to accept. He had so much press, so much support. Even an artist like Jürgen Teller, we haven't seen this support for him in the United States since years. And we've seen people hungry to come in to experience something which is real, which is rich, which is one-on-one, which is something they can take home, which is physical. So as we talk on Zoom, and I'm so thankful, I have to say, that we are living in the 21st century, that we are not in the Spanish flu pandemic when this was happening, because we are all communicating, all of us from different parts of the world. However, there is real hunger. This is how I see that over the past 7 months for physical.
Yeah, for the physical, agreed.
Yeah.
Ayo, if we could turn to you, you've got a gallery in Fitzrovia in London, but you also operate a project space in Lagos in Nigeria. I mean, we'll come to that in a bit, but could you just tell us a bit about the situation in Nigeria and whether the shift to the local has been a help or a hindrance to galleries there?
I couldn't speak to the commercial galleries because we actually run a project space in Lagos, you see. So it's not a commercial entity. It's pretty much a not-for-profit space to engage with the collectors we have out there. The thing about the project space is, even though it's remote, I made it a point of duty to actually go to all the openings in Lagos when it was happening. And if I'm not able to travel to Lagos, Nigeria during the pandemic, I'm not able to have shows there. If I've created a hub where I could engage one-on-one with collectors, there's no point putting on shows if I'm not going to be there, and if the artist is not going to be there as well. Especially since a few of the artists we showed in these spaces were also based outside of Nigeria. So there was a coming back home feeling to the project space for myself and the artist. The pandemic has totally shut that down. Speaking maybe vaguely to other dealers, especially secondary market dealers in Nigeria, they're still active. They're still a collective base. I think that's everywhere else in the world has slowed down massively in terms of travel and business dynamism and the likes. Is also slowed down the economy, but it also means people are present. And what I mean by that is that some of my collectors that couldn't spend 2 minutes on the phone previously have suddenly got 45 minutes to talk about art. And I'm sure other dealers in the country are seeing that as well. So there's a lot more engagement. It's not all leading to sale, but I do know I've got a few people's audience that just didn't have the time previously.
Perhaps we come to our second question then, which is how have your galleries fostered cross-cultural dialogues as some borders remain closed? And I'm sure we've spoken a bit about technology. I'm sure technology has played a key role, but Ayo, perhaps we could come back to you, because you mentioned something when we had our previous discussion about you not being local, and I just thought that was a really interesting concept. I wondered if you could just elaborate on that and tell us what you mean by you don't have a local.
It's true. We've had to, maintain cross-cultural dialogue. I've got Nigerian artists, I've got other African artists, I've got artists that actually live on the continent, I've got artists that live outside of the continent. I've got a strong collective base in Africa because I deal in African arts. But there's also a vast African diaspora. And if you take into consideration the African-American population as well that do buy art of African descent, I said it to you that no, I don't have a local. Black is my local. And that's because they're Black. And it's a luxury I'm so proud of, and I continue to push forward, because if I've got African-Americans buying African art, Africans buying African art, the rest of the world buying African art as well. But if the primary drivers of that engagement are the African producers themselves and Black collectors everywhere, I have to treat every Black person as a potential local audience. And I've been doing that all along, and it's actually kept my gallery going. And I'm sure it's going to keep it going post-COVID.
I mean, it's interesting. So in that sense, your local is international. But something you also mentioned was that last year your London sales to London buyers began to have international sales, which I thought was interesting. Is there a shift to London as a locality in that sense? It's
happened slowly. I think you're coming from a low base as well. So like I mentioned to you, at some point in London, after spending about 5 years in London, I found nearly 70% of my collectors were actually on the continent of Africa, right? So I was always hitting an international audience. The more I started to do the more mainstream art fairs, the AMRI, and we did TAFAP this year, the more your international collector base expands, right? Then 154 as well, because it's a London-based, or 154 London, it's a London-based fair. I started to see the shift more last year, which I shared with you that this is when we had more London-based collectors buying from us for the first time than international collectors. And that's actually happening this year as well. For the first time, we nearly had a predominantly London-based collecting set. But that's because the Americans didn't really fly into London for 154 as they typically would. You didn't get the international collectors, you didn't get the Europeans, virtually no Chinese or Middle Eastern collectors. So yes, we are in a sense being forced to go local. Now this is the new local for me. So it's a very new local. I'm being forced to speak English more fluently because I'm selling to London. So it's a very weird dynamic situation for me where I'm reversing a trend, a collecting trend.
That's fascinating, Ayo. Thank you. Sundaram, if we could ask you a bit about how you've maintained those cross-cultural dialogues. I mean, your gallery strapline is that you show art that merges Western culture with global influences. How have you kept that dialogue across borders going?
I mean, we are a gallery devoted to the ideas of intercultural dialogue, and that's the basis of our gallery. And what that means is essentially globalization. And for good or for bad, I felt that captured the zeitgeist of our time. And also we needed to celebrate the interconnectedness, because I felt somehow monoculture did not make any sense. We are sharing the same water, we're inhaling the same air, we are using the same natural resources. Now we have to tackle this virus globally, It cannot be isolated. So any kind of monoculture has like no meaning for us, especially people if you're living in places like New York or London or Singapore or any of these places, people are pouring in from every corner of the world. So that's the reason I started showing, when I opened the gallery in 1999, 2000, I started showing a lot of older women artists who were being neglected, actually. And there were circuit of Rauschenberg and Jasper Jones, and none of the galleries were paying any attention to them. So they're very talented women artists, New York, from the New York School. I started showing them. Then I started including Middle Eastern artists. Then I went further and started showing South Asian artists, now having opened in Hong Kong and Singapore, East Asian and other Asian artists. Now we have artists from Brazil all the way to Australia. So and one of the reasons is that because we live in this kind of a global stage, right? And the collector base, as we traveled with the art fairs, our collectors got globalized. So it was quite easy for us to present an artist from the Middle East somewhere in Sydney and say, we are presenting them. That was novel for them, and yet it was exciting, and they bought these artworks. But I also realized when you live in places like this in the current stage, diversity is in your backyard. But although the diversity is in your backyard, it's directly under your nose. But what happens is that when I looked at data, and when you look at the art market, that is not the case. And when you look at it, I saw in terms of auction records, I'm talking about 2% of sales were only by women artists, 1.2% Black artists, 9% Asian artists. That's the totality. Rest is largely Western male artists. So that's the data that's saying. So we are talking about diversity, but does diversity really exist? And that's one of the reasons when Black Lives Matter became very important here in the States. All the museums and galleries came after sort of Black artists, and they wanted to be more diversified in their program. But everyone is trying to be all embracive, and I hope the pandemic kind of recreates a space for people from different communities. They're producing amazing works. Art is based on whether they are from, you're talking about gender, you're talking about ethnicity, and they're producing remarkable works. I went to Philippines, I saw amazing works of art. Those artists are not being represented here, or you don't get to see them that often. So the same way with African countries, there's so many amazing works that I saw, but it's very hard for us to connect with them because you have to have a network. It's not easy to pick up these artists. So, but I think the pandemic is going to do an amazing thing. Maybe something really positive will come out of this.
And you're saying diversity is under our noses. I mean, but really we need to be incorporating that into the gallery programs and into gallery staffing. Yeah, it feels like we're on that's really significant at the moment in particular. Rachel, if I could ask you how you've maintained cross-cultural dialogues as borders remain closed.
So, you have picked all those galleries on this panel, which is so interesting because all of us have a very diverse program of artists, right? That's completely our mission and was the mission of Lehmann. I think what has happened, and that's a mission, right? This is what you believe in the future. But I think there is a change which happened, and it will help me answer the second part again of your question. You see, those big centers that we used to look at as the only centers, if you call it New York, or if you want to call it London, or if you even want to call it Hong Kong, that has been disappearing slowly pre-COVID, right? Why? Because the access all of us have to local markets. Why? Because of art fairs and because of travel. Now, what happened now with COVID, right? This was even more emphasized, right? So the question, how do you maintain those connections internationally or in a bigger way? We have pushed what you call the online viewing rooms, the OVR, which many art fairs have done as well. We have at the same time pushed markets which are very local market with pop-up shows. And we have done a very successful Aspen pop-up show. Okay, we had a local person from Dallas who drove to Aspen to had it. But then what she was hosting there was a dialogue of diverse languages, diverse artists, diverse countries. But we were forced to do it we are doing, hopefully it opens by the end of the month. We are doing a local art fair, which is called Busan Art Fair in Korea, which we have never participated in. That Busan will be again an image of what we at Lehmann do, right? It won't be just Korean artists. It will be South American, it will be American, it will be South African. And I think so, maintaining this local, which has become more important suddenly, that local is bringing now the connection to the global, and physically and through the many internet and social medias and OVRs of our days.
You're taking part in a number of fairs, aren't you, in Asia? There's the Hong Kong Spotlight, which is a sort of smaller collaboration with Art Basel. You've mentioned Art Busan, and then West Bund in Shanghai.
Right.
There's obviously a need, there's a thirst and a hunger to have these physical fairs, albeit in smaller formats. I mean, how, you know, is that your take? And how have the OVRs been for you in real terms? Are they?
Well, so this is a very good question. The OVR took on so dramatically in the beginning, and then they quiet down in a certain way. What we know today, or we think we know today, is that the OVRs are there to stay, however, not without the physical. So we do see crossovers, we do see sales on the OVRs, but very often it is existing crossover from the physical entities or from physical art fairs we haven't done before, or physical pop-up. So I think the OVR becomes at least the new go-to added element to the physical experience. You were talking about Art Basel, Hong Kong. I find it so fascinating what they have done, because if you remember, they were the first to go global, right? With Miami Art Fair that nobody understood at the time, which sounded very local to us, right? And now what they did is, not knowing maybe if Hong Kong Basel will happen, the international fair, they partnered or supported a local fair. And I think this is where we are. The local becomes the international. The local, it will bring in the cross-cultural that we all on this panel, I'm so happy about it. Annie, thank you for including me and everybody else, is have it in our DNA because of who we are.
Thank you, Rachel. That was insightful. Rakeb, I mean, to talk a bit about the art fair situation, I know you used to do sort of eight to 10 a year. I mean, how have you maintained cross-cultural dialogues in absence?
So our gallery, the way that we set it up was really with this idea in mind anyway, because we set up in a place where it was isolated from the art market, from on every level, linguistically, historically. It was, you know, it's isolated. So we decided to open there because actually what we really wanted, and coming to Sundaram's point about diversity, is that, you know, even when we talk about Africa, for example, there is a multiplicity within Africa. It's not one thing, and it's never been one thing. And places like Ethiopia are really difficult because there isn't, you know, you need the network, as you said, there's a linguistic barrier, there isn't, you know, a colonial link to anywhere. So really, unless we kind of start looking at our own art history and elevating it, which is what Masai and I, you know, discussed and are trying to do, it will kind of remain forgotten or just buried under everything else. So really, our gallery is quite tight in its remit. It's really trying to get Ethiopia, and kind of regionally with countries that are related to Ethiopia, Eritrea being one of them, maybe a bit of Somalia and Sudan, because we're linked art historically. So all of these countries have a shared art history that hasn't been discovered at all. So we are really, we have a tight remit, but actually we bring so much knowledge to the table, because otherwise nobody else is really looking at this. So for us, when we opened the gallery, physical gallery in Addis, which was important to engage the local scene and the local collectors and to build on what was already there, we immediately set up our international platform, which is, I think we did our very first fair we did when we were 6 weeks old as a gallery, and that was the Armory in New York, a baptism by fire for us. But it was really important for us to create a local space for the art to be seen by locals, but engage the wider market almost immediately. So we've kind of done this ever since we started, because we've had to. We've always had a really strong online presence. I think our website and social media was live before the physical gallery was there. And that's now taken a whole new dimension. And interestingly, last September, so a year ago, we upgraded all of our tools. We had a, online viewing room, pretty much everything that we needed before COVID hit. And I mean, not that we were planning for COVID, but it was always a driver for our sales and for just disseminating information about the artists that we represent. So this cross-cultural dialogue is something that we've done from day one, and we just continue to do it. It's really important for us and for our artists to be seen side by side by their counterparts all over the world. So that is really our mission as a gallery. So, I mean, what COVID has done, I'll agree with a lot of the panel, what people have said on the panel, is that it has deepened conversations for sure. And I think people have had time to really go deeper and look at the things that we've been talking about, for, looking at the art history. For example, we have a really old art school in Ethiopia that was opened in the 50s. We talk about it all the time, but I think now some people have started researching and kind of doing more fact-finding, so we have time, people have time to really kind of get to grips with the things that we're trying to put in front of them. And that has led to really good quality conversations and sales. And we haven't really stopped. We've signed a couple of artists during COVID. Our London operation stalled, but we've kept things moving. We just did 154, which was actually really, really interesting, because people that came really wanted to be there. They were there to buy. They were really engaged customers. We've had, and also because the pace of the fair was so intimate and so slow, if you like, we managed to meet every single person that came into the booth and talk to them, and we had the time. I think what this period has given us, at least for us, we're a young gallery, we're 5 years old, and we've been running for 5 years literally, for locally and internationally, and it gave us time to really stop and look at our program, really get to know our clients, and really get to know, kind of really plan for the next maybe 5 years, 10 years. And I think it's been a really good time for us in that sense.
That leads me on nicely to looking forward to the next 5 or 10 years, perhaps not that far in advance, because we don't really know what's going to happen within the next sort of 5 weeks, 5 days even. But I'd like to ask all our panelists, it's probably going to be a bit of a quick fire round because we've got 5 minutes for the Q&A. About, I'd like to ask you all how you view the situation going forward. I mean, do you think you'll go back to doing the same number of fairs and travelling exhibitions, or do you see a more global approach which incorporates aspects of the global and local? Rakeb, I'll come back to you.
Yeah, I mean, we were doing like ridiculous number of fairs a year, like we were doing 10 a year, which really before COVID hit, we did say to ourselves that's a little, we need to reduce that. But I think we were waiting until Cromwell Place came online, and we would kind of move a lot of our international programming into Cromwell Place, because I think that gives us a base to continue to meet with our international clients. So I think our fair attendance will drop. I think definitely the technology aspect is here to stay, and I think it will get more and more refined. So and there are more players coming into the sphere as well. So I think things like VR might get better, but again, I think that it's going to be technology with the physical, as Rochelle said. I think there is no, I don't think you can really replicate walking into a room with a beautiful painting. You know, your heart will just jump out of it. You know, it's very difficult to do that. So I would say it's
hybrid approach going forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you, Rakeb. Ayo, how about you? What do you see for the future? More local approach, a mixture of local and global?
The first thing I'll say to that is I'm definitely determined not to make any strategic decisions during the pandemic. The chaos is just too much for me to plan the future accurately. But I will say, you know, Rakeb is right. It needs a bit of a hybrid. Personally, I was going to slow down the fairs. If you have a small gallery and you're the face of the gallery, there's only so many places you could go physically yourself. And that was already taking its toll way before the pandemic. You know, so we're going to squeeze down on the amount of fairs we do. We have to step up our technology. You know, WhatsApp is still my tech media of choice. I'm just too old school. We need to move into something more dynamic. I'm quite keen on VR, but the technology itself needs to catch up with what the possibilities are. And I think, you know, we're having conversations with actually techies on that to say, what can you do for us? You know, this is what we want to do. Is there any way technology can bring that forward? And then we'll just take it from there.
Rochelle, what would you say? I mean,
well, I'm going to be a little bit more dramatic. I think this is a pandemic. We haven't had something like this since 100 years. And the art world cannot be always it shouldn't be disconnected from the world. I think it's very dangerous. We have many major issues, but I want to touch on one in particular as we speak about traveling and art fair and so on, which is carbon footprint, energy consumption, the future of the world. And as all of you know, scientists say that this is one of the reasons we are having COVID. So I believe there will be real big changes. And I know of museums, international, very well-known museums in Europe, which are considering not to travel shows anymore from the United States or to the United States, and vice versa. I know that galleries will have to adapt. We will have to be more, we must save this planet. We will have to be more collaborative, think it through when we want to travel shows, and collaborate with other galleries, with other museums. I think this is maybe the good outcome of all of it. So yeah, I don't see stopping art fairs. I think it's a necessity. I don't see doing it as we did it before, because there's a long tail to this COVID, and there'll be changes through the society and in the art world. So definitely local approach, but we should, all of us, remain very flexible and adaptable, because I think there are bigger changes to come.
Thank you for raising the climate crisis issue. I think it's hugely important. Sundaram, if I could ask you lastly, how do you see the next year playing out? More local approach?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I really agree with Rachel in this respect, that we have to be conscious of the world that we're creating. And I've been really aware of this, of the excessive travel. The art world, like the world itself, became really excessive. And so what happened is that we were traveling to so many art fairs, and the art fairs are not enough. You have to have multiple galleries across the world. Then that's not good enough. Then you have to go to biennales and triennales and then museum openings, and never ending. It's like a treadmill running around like a headless chicken. And so at this point, I feel with this pandemic going on, you have a much more introspective world. Every time I would speak to an artist, always about, can you send me this work of art? Or the artist would say, can you pay me for this? So those are kind of conversation. Now it's all about personal conversation. You know, how are your children doing? How are you going to respond? So some of the artists that I've been conversing, one group of artists, they had a really, what should I say? They were very creative, and they were producing some heroic scale works, and it was remarkable. Then the other group essentially saying, I'm really deeply sort of sorrowful. I don't know. I've become a recluse. I don't want to talk to anyone. So there's two distinct groups that's taking shape and form, right? And so we have to realize what kind of a world that we want to create, and what kind of a legacy we want to leave behind for our children. And I think if we don't really pay attention to that, we are in serious trouble. And the pandemic is part of that problem that we haven't paid attention to. So this is critically important. Collaboration, I agree, absolutely. Collaboration is a key factor, that you don't have to be all the time. If you find a kindred spirit in the art world, you can sort of connect with that individual and collaborate, because we were existing in a kind of atomized world. Very few galleries, unless they were sharing artists or unless they're dealing with secondary art market, they hardly really work with one another. But that will change. That will definitely change. And if we can't collaborate, we're in trouble. And the same way, I've attended conferences where museums directors were telling the continuous process of expansion. Every 10 years, one after another. It's not tenable. And I feel attending so many art fairs and so many events and clients sort of events for daughter's wedding or so and so forth, we have to attend in order to create those client relationships. It's not possible. So I will reduce it down significantly.
Reduce, but more meaningful when you do meet, perhaps.
Slower and more meaningful and more thoughtful interaction.
Sure. Thank you, Sundaram. We have a lot of questions I can see racking up in our Q&A box here. So I'm going to turn to questions now. I'm just going to ask all the panelists. I'm going to pick a few. And if anyone feels a burning desire to answer, please do. This is a good one about how artists can engage in their local markets and what can they expect to be the same and what will be different to all the panel. So how can artists engage in their local markets and what can they expect to be the same and what would be different?
Well, I don't think it has to be local. I mean, we are digitally, we're connected. Look at this, Zoom. We couldn't even imagine prior to COVID that we'll have 500 plus people listening to this conversation. So essentially you have the technology. So you may be based in New York, but you can connect with folks in Sydney or Hong Kong or London, wherever. So that digitally you're connected, and so you have access to the world, but you're placed, you don't have to travel so much. And you find that diversity, that intercultural dialogue, you're able to foster those ideas based wherever you are through technology. And that's the best part of us, technology. That's my reaction.
No, and I would agree. I mean, one of the things that we did during lockdown, we were attending Freeze Art Fair, just the online version, and we did a lot of studio visits on Zoom. So, you know, I was actually quarantining in Ethiopia. My gallery manager was in London. We were showing an artist who was based in New York, and clients from all over the world, they wanted to have a studio visit, and we were able to make that happen. And I think that kind of ability is so powerful, even though, you know, we're a gallery from Ethiopia, which sometimes has no internet. Actually, we can still access, you know, the rest of the world. All of our clients are all over the world, but also we have artists who live all over the world, because we've just had waves and waves of, you know, we have the diaspora to also deal with. So we have artists all over the world. So we can, this technology, this moment in time is really making it possible for a young gallery from Ethiopia to be on this panel and talk to all of these people, and also create a market where a market was not really there for the artists that we work with before. So that's a very positive aspect of the here and now.
I agree, and I'm hearing from young artists actually that they are having a much quicker recognition, debut, dialogue due to those different technical possibilities. And it's becoming more and more the new normal due to this period where that was the only way to connect. So the old-fashioned model, which we are all part of, and I'm happy to be part of it, let me just say that gallery is enhanced by those technical connections, but it's mostly the artists who can take advantage of it. It's actually a positive place for the voices of the artists to be heard.
I agree.
Super interesting, thank you. There's a great question here I can see, which says, it sounds like, oh, did you, Ayo, was that a...
Sorry, it's my, never mind, carry on.
No, please go ahead, please. Oh, you're right, you're setting the lighting, got it.
It's on a timer.
Got you.
But I'm doing my part for the environment.
Well, thank you, that's good to see. So this question's great. It sounds like despite the pandemic, you were able to maintain relationships with current clients and collectors. How have you been able to attract new collectors or clients to the panel?
So it's a great question for me to answer this morning, because just before we went on this panel, I had the overview results of the OVRs and all the online platforms that we have, and including our website, old-fashioned website, which was enhanced. And to my great surprise, we have had an increase of new clients, all from those new technical social platforms. I didn't believe it, but those new clients, which usually use those tools and sometimes might have visited us before, but we don't know yet. This is very fresh new, but I can confirm this morning that we have had new collectors growing through the new technology tools that we have access to. Now, if I look at something which is more physical, it's interesting, right? Because we closed Aspen, which was a pop-up show, which closed, I believe, the middle of September, right? Well, Aspen was 90% existing buyers, only 10% new buyers. However, again, I'm putting it in comparison to new technologies. That's where the bigger number came from in the last 6 months.
And is there a specific demographic you're seeing buying online? Is it younger collectors, or is it across the board? Or is there a trend you can see? I
believe, it's very fresh this morning, and we need all to dig into it this morning, but it's younger. It's definitely younger. And I don't have honestly yet the results for the demographic footprint, but definitely younger.
I found something slightly more analog, actually. Again, because the pace of the world has slowed and we're having difficult conversations with existing collectors, we are finding the word of mouth recommendation has actually grown dramatically. Because if someone has time to think about art, think about what he's collecting, and asks a friend, oh, I want to start collecting, who should I speak to? And then your existing collector, so you should speak to my dealer in London, Ayo. This is more maybe a second market play, because I do 20th century African art. But I'm finding that I'm getting lots of text messages and phone. People that have actually asked in the past, don't you have friends who collect or who want to collect? They now suddenly have the time to think about this and recommend something. So that we found interesting. Again, it's just the slower pace, people are having more time to think about what they want in life and just do things they've promised.
But new collectors via word of mouth rather than...
Exactly. So I'm finding word of mouth from existing collectors, just because my existing collectors have more time to, think about these things.
Is anyone else?
Yeah, so for us, I mean, the technology has always been a driver for new clients, and it has accelerated slightly, but we get a lot of our new clients from all of the either the social or the website or all of the platforms we're on. But of course, we've just done 154. There's always new clients from fairs that we get. So yeah, I mean, because we are a young gallery, a huge proportion of our sales go to new clients every year anyway. So it's kind of it's just part of our growth right now.
I've also noticed, I was recently having a conversation with a journalist, and he mentioned the millennials have become an important factor in the art world in terms of acquisition of art. And so because of this group, we have to get a lot more technologically savvy. And I believe, this is what my thought, I believe that art world, the folks in the art world we are really backward in terms of technology compared to other retail industries. If you look at fashion, which they're dealing with visual elements, they're far better. And of course, we are a smaller organization and with sort of not the same kind of financial backing a fashion industry would have. But still, we have to get in order to access all these clients that's there.
Okay.
There's a good question here about who you're selling to in terms of, are you selling to individual collectors or corporate collectors and or museum collections? I mean, I'm interested to know if you're selling to any museums, I mean, particularly public museums. I mean, presumably, the COVID has impacted them deeply. I'd be interested to know who you're selling to.
We are selling to museum trustees, and hopefully they will actually give it as a gift to the museums. And the museums don't have the same kind of thick wallets anymore, but we are selling to individual, quite a few trustees of museums, and also corporate collections. So of course, those are ideal scenario. We'll sell it to anyone, actually, people who really care about our artists and they're willing to present the artist in the proper context. And especially if there happens to be demand for that artist, we can be more selective in terms of, but ideal situation would be a museum. And we have managed to place a lot of our artists in major museums. And we are thankful about that.
So I have to say that I'm very worried about the larger public museums. And in for our example, those museums have not been buying or very, very, very little. Private foundations, obviously, are still there, trustees, but it's worrisome on many levels. If we look at the drop of tourism, right? And I'm talking tourism, I'm talking also between cities, a place like the United States, right? And we know that museums, at least in New York, 70% of their visitors are outside of the state of New York. It's very worrisome. And when me as a gallerist, if I know that museums cannot be the third part of what I need, which is a support for the artist, meaning the collector, the gallery, and the museum, and the artists in the middle, it's very worrisome, and it will also unfortunately bring in changes. We have seen, which I completely understand, we have seen many reserves which were canceled, which were supposed to go through in the second half of the year. So post-COVID reserves and just waiting to go to acquisitions meeting. And we have seen, a real drop in public museums acquisitions.
I think this is a very good question. And it just presents different dynamisms. The museum trustees, museum relationship fantastic situation, but it's very American-centric, for example. So we're not seeing that. I sell a lot to individuals. I sell to some foundations, and I sell directly to museums. Now, what I always say is, my more typical business friends, my banker friends always says, surely the low-hanging fruits is just the corporates, right? What about all these Chinese businesses that do things in Africa? Surely they're buying art en masse. And the answer is, quite frankly, no. Because again, art is just not that easy to define. And Sundaram raised very good points about diversifying the museum's collection, right? And this, again, my business friends, I think, you're in the money, Ayo. Surely they're all going to come running to you to buy African art, and maybe Rakeb as well, to buy all these African and Ethiopian art to populate the collections. But we know, for example, in the UK context, the museums they're cash strapped. And they're going to be cash strapped for the foreseeable future based on what's going on. Where are they going to find this money to diversify their collections? So that's why I say it's a very important and very, very good question, because we all have to creatively think about ways to sell to more people individually as a business, but we also have to creatively think about ways to repair this imbalance in the museum collections. And somehow, as galleries, we have to find a way to help them to diversify their collection. Maybe we have to create these trust relationships in the UK and Europe as well, because it works very well for the New York setup, for example. I mean, nearly every single artist I've sold to a museum in America is via a trustee. So I know it works, but it just doesn't exist here. And it doesn't, I don't know where else it does exist, actually. And so it's a very, very good question. And I think it's one of those positions that the world needs to change. The world is not going to change too quickly just because of the way things are. But even us calling for the change need to help the change in more creative ways.
Rakeb, would you like to add to?
So, I mean, I think I agree with Ayo. It's worrisome, as well as what Rachel said, that, museums are now cash strapped, and it's not necessarily something that is going to change anytime soon. One thing I have seen is foundations that are currently being set up on the continent. We have sold a few, or we have now seen a few come up who are willing to really buy and preserve art on the continent, which I think is an incredibly important endeavor. So that kind of trend, if that catches on, and if we see a number of institutions popping up on the continent, for me, that would be a real win. And I've seen a couple that have bought from us recently, and I'm hoping that is going to catch on, and that's going to be a trend, because that's important, because the art has to also kind of stay on the continent. We want to be able, and that's the part of the reason why Addis Fine Art opened a space in Addis to begin with, is because people at home need to have access to see, to buy, to preserve art that means a lot more to them than anyone else, really. So I think that's my focus. I want to be able to sell into the continent, into places where I know that the artists are going to be put into collections that also make sense art historically. We need to be able to dissect Africa. I mean, I'm only talking from the African perspective, but I think it's true for anywhere else. You have to make sense of each region in a deep way, rather than say, it's just African art. That actually doesn't mean much when you really see the multiplicity of Africa and the diversity of stories and art histories and histories there are on the continent. So I know I didn't answer your question very well, but I think I'm just saying that, I've seen good, I've got hope that new foundations are popping up and emerging on the continent that we can potentially help and sell to and support.
Well, it'd be good to end on a hopeful note. So I'm going to have to unfortunately leave it there. There are a lot of unanswered questions, but we've actually run out of time. So it just leaves me to thank all our panelists and everyone watching, and to remind you that the third panel in this series is next Thursday, the 22nd of October at 5 p.m. And will feature Georgina Adam, the Art Newspaper's editor-at-large, and the cultural economist Claire McAndrew. So I hope you can join us then.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.